Hello and welcome to the Green Finance Session. I'm Mark Barton. World leaders are gathered here in Glasgow at COP26 to accelerate action on tackling climate change. To achieve this, governments must work with international multilateral organizations, private sector institutions, and other emerging development partners to act quickly and collaborate. The value of global partnerships is clear, and one partner is needed more than ever: the financial community. The Republic of the Philippines is on the front lines of the climate crisis, yet it's determined to punch above its weight in green and climate finance. Today, we'll be discussing how a developing country like the Philippines can lead in terms of mainstreaming climate action through the financial sector. We'll also highlight the challenges poorer nations face in tackling climate change and assess what role global finance, along with international governments and development banks, must play to help developing nations green their economies and financial systems. Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to welcome Masatsugu Asakawa, President of the Asian Development Bank, to deliver an opening statement.
Okay, thank you. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us at this very important event focused on the crucial role of the financial sector in combating climate change. Well, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to the Honorable Secretary of Finance and ADB Governor for the Republic of the Philippines, Mr. Carlos Dominguez, and to Time Magazine for hosting our discussion today. My friends, as I have said before, the battle against climate change will be won or lost in Asia and the Pacific. Through green finance, we can join together to mount a sustainable and equitable response. Let me highlight two key areas where the financial sector can contribute to this effort in our region. First, we must work together to deepen and expand our green capital markets. By doing so, we can tap the current global momentum on green, social, and sustainable, or GSS bonds, which has been issuance of these instruments almost double from 2019 to 2020 to reach $700 billion in 2020, with Asia Pacific GSS issuance amounting for 23%. In this regard, ADB is working with countries in Southeast Asia to scale up green COVID-19 recovery bonds. For example, we have supported the government of Thailand in issuing the region's very first sustainable bond for COVID-19 recovery in 2020, which raised almost $1 billion. Initiatives like this will accelerate the flow of global institutional capital to support a green recovery in the region. Second, we should make innovative use of public funds as well to mitigate the risks that may constrain global private capital flows into national and regional financing platforms. Later today, we will launch a so-called Green Recovery Platform linked to the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility. This platform will help to leverage public sector funds and catalyze public and private capital into projects by up to 10-fold. Tomorrow, we will introduce our Energy Transition Mechanism Partnership, or ETM, which will use blended finance to accelerate the retirement or repurposing of coal-fired power plants in our region. ADB is also partnering with Temasek Holdings Singapore and HSBC to develop a platform that will mobilize private investment for sustainable infrastructure projects in Southeast Asia. So, ladies and gentlemen, these and other initiatives are a valuable part of ADB's overall commitment to take bold and urgent action against climate change. As I mentioned last month, we are raising our ambition to deliver 100 billion US dollar in cumulative climate financing between 2019 and 2030, including 34 billion US dollars in cumulative adaptation and resilience investments. We have also updated our energy policy quite recently to formally withdraw from financing new coal-fired power generation and support the development of sustainable and resilient energy systems in our developing member countries in line with the Paris Agreement. We look forward to working with you as the Climate Bank for Asia and the Pacific as we achieve a green recovery together. Thank you very much for your attention.
It's my pleasure to introduce my panelists today. Carlos Dominguez, Secretary of Finance, the Philippines. Ahmed Saeed, ADB Vice President for East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. And Dr. Jonathan Pershing, US Deputy Special Envoy for Climate. Carlos, if I can start with you, the Philippines. You are representing the Philippines. The Philippines clearly is punching above its weight in green and in climate finance. How are you mobilizing finance for investments and greening the financial system to tackle climate change?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that to tackle climate change, two of the most important elements are technology and finance. And in our view, the climate change finance should cover three elements. First is a grant portion of it to increase people's capacity to understand and take action against climate change. The second element is private sector and government investments in projects that will mitigate climate change effects. And the third element is a subsidy element to help transition from where we are today to a greener future. So the Philippines has realized this and has taken action. We realize that we are one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, and we have decided to do action on our own. And we will not wait for international agreements for climate change. But however, we hope that this COP26 will result in positive action and will start the flow of funds to help countries like ourselves.
Climate finance, Carlos, is something we're going to talk about in detail later. A perfect introduction. Jonathan, if I can bring you in. From your perspective, how effective are Asia and Pacific nations in mobilizing finance to adapt to and to mitigate climate change?
So I would start with three pieces as well, kind of like Carlos did. We think about climate in terms of the problem. It has two dimensions. The first is a mitigation question. What kind of resources are required to reduce emissions? The second is an adaptation question. What kind of resources are necessary to manage the dynamics and the impacts? And in that space, I think, what's the development agenda and how does it intersect? Because the Asian region is not a region that is uniform. There are different capacities in different countries. And so therefore you have to do all three. I think Asia has had mixed success. I would argue that some of the more advanced economies in the region have been very capable in extracting resources and mobilizing global capital. I would argue some of the least developed countries in the region have done rather poorly. And to a certain extent, that's a capacity constraint. What I'm seeing in the middle income economies is actually enormous progress. And that's the place to watch from a mitigation perspective. But I'm still seeing enormous numbers of people around the Asian region who are at risk and for whom resources are not yet available, and where I think the global community will need to invest more.
So Ahmed, Jonathan's scorecard has mixed on it. Is that fair from where you're sitting? Mixed success, talking about the Asia and Pacific region.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think it's far too early to declare victory, certainly in this battle. But we have seen, areas of real progress. I think the Philippines certainly stands out as a country that's done a number of things in the right direction. And I think the overarching, image from my side is one of both great risk and great opportunity as we confront climate change, because it represents not just an enormous source of vulnerability and threat to the populations of Southeast Asia and the Philippines, but also, as we mobilize technology and financing, as the Secretary said, a tremendous opportunity to drive more positive development outcomes.
Yeah. Let's mention our first acronym. We've banned acronyms, by the way. If you say an acronym, you've got to explain what it is. NDCs, we all know what it means, National Determined Contributions. I want to get to the Philippines. Basically, you've pledged to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions by 75% by 2030. 2.7% of that is unconditional. 72.3% is conditional. So to achieve your NDC, Carlos, how reliant are you, this is the big question, on support internationally in financing, technology transfer, and capacity building?
Very reliant. There's no question about it. However, as I said, we are going to start on our own, and we hope that the world at large will come and support us. But, we have to realize that each country has to take their own action for others to follow. We can't wait for them to dictate to us what to do.
Yeah. Is the world at large, Ahmed, help coming? I mean, the world at large, you're representing the ADB. How are you helping Asia and Pacific nations, meet those NDCs?
Well, I think that it's an enormously important priority. Maybe perhaps there's no greater priority for us in the coming years ahead. One of the recent announcements that we did make at the ADB is that we increased our climate financing ambition to $100 billion as an institution between now and 2030. And so we're certainly looking to step up on the financing side, but we are equally, if not more, engaged in terms of supporting countries on regulatory reform and planning, because we talk about the money that's needed to support this transition, but it's not just money. There's a whole host of other actions that have to move in concert with money. And in some ways, in fact, money is not the leading indicator of success in this battle. It's the lagging indicator of success. There are other things that have to happen first before the money can be effectively deployed. So, for example, Secretary referred to the importance of private sector capital flowing into green investments. Well, that's an area where we have to do work to create an appropriate investment regime so that that capital can be received, so that it can earn appropriate returns, and so that it creates a self-perpetuating cycle of success. So that would be one example, but there are many others as well.
Yeah. And do you want to jump in there, John?
No, I think that's right. I think that one of the things that the global community is fixated on is public capital, public finance. And I would submit that the effort that's been mounted by the donor countries who have primarily sought to raise that capital, and they're very close. They'll reach the $100 billion probably next year. So that's late by a year or so, but it's basically meeting the objective that was set in Paris. And that is a trivial share of what we're anticipated to need. The share is just in the energy sector alone, measured at $3 trillion. So $100 billion is not in the right domain if we think about that. But if it's catalytic, if it's seeking to shape investment risk, if it's changing capacity, then I think Ahmed's entirely right. Then you mobilize this private capital, and we heard in the meetings here, there's $85 trillion waiting on the sides to come into the system.
Let's talk about mobilizing. And as we're all showing off with figures, I'm going to show off Jonathan as well. I love your figures, by the way. I'm a real figures guy. The Philippines, Carlos, to transition to clean energy alone is going to cost you, it's going to require $121 billion over 20 years. That's a lot of money, isn't it? So how are you mobilizing that? Who's funding that cost?
Well, first of all, we are in deep conversation with multilateral agencies, particularly the ADB. In fact, we are working on a very important energy transition project, which I think not only will help us, but could be a model for other countries to use. But again, that is just the start. And as I mentioned earlier, $121 billion for the Philippines over 20 years is a lot of funds. So we will have to look not only to our taxpayers, but we will have to look to private investors as well as multilateral investors and donor countries to help us along this path.
And don't even say a whisper, Ahmed, about the energy transition mechanism. I'm saving that. So just hold off on speaking. Hold off on speaking about that. What's the US doing specifically, Jonathan? Because everyone's going to be watching this thinking, and we're going to come on to the US's role globally a bit later. But what's the US doing specifically to help these nations, these Asia and Pacific nations, achieve their NDCs?
So I'm going to start first back on Carlos's point and the scale. I think the scale is probably pretty robust. The numbers that we've got are probably pretty robust. I think the distinction that's worth drawing is we're not needing that as an increment. We're needing part of that to be diverted from what otherwise would have been a different form of investment. So if we think about this, in many cases, we were going to make energy investment. We were going to make transport and infrastructure investment. We just wanted to be greened. Now the delta, the difference of what you would have done and what you're now doing isn't the full scale, it's some subset of that. And in some cases, it might be in the long run less expensive. So I think we should calculate part of that into the effect. That can be subsidized. It will be subsidized. The US is one of the partners engaging in that discussion. So just a few places. We committed as part of the global community to provide resources to help catalyze and mobilize $100 billion. During the Trump administration, that didn't happen. We've come back in, and because of our budget process, the first year where money can move is actually next year because of our cycle. But we've committed now $11.5 billion into that system. But that's money that's not counted what will be additionally mobilized by capital. That'll come in through places like the Development Finance Corporation, our DFC, which is really looking at leveraging private investment. That will come in through an accelerating coal transition program the World Bank is running. That will come in through multilateral banks to which we make contributions. That will come in direct grants and loans to the U.S. Agency for International Development. So we've got this entire cohort, and a great deal will be very specific. It'll be tied to countries. It'll be tied to country demand.
Is it unfortunate then, Jonathan, we've got this focus on 100 billion when, as you just explained there's so much going on beneath the surface?
Yeah. And in my mind, that's the thing we really should be emphasizing. And I think it comes back to Ahmed's point and Carlos's point. At the end of the day, we're going to make investment. The question is, which choice do we have? Do we choose the green one, or do we choose the less green one, the one that's coal, the one that's high intensity? We actually have a choice. And in the medium term, it's in the wash. In the long term, it's cheaper to do the clean.
And Ahmed, sorry.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to jump in on that because you had said that in most areas it'll be cheaper to do green. I think that according to the IEA, there's sort of 36 major net zero technologies, 4 of which are already at the point where they're cheaper, 32 are not. And the challenge there is just one of scaling them. We have every reason to believe that each of these technologies will end up being cheaper than its non-green alternative. And that's without even incorporating the cost of carbon, right? And if we incorporate the cost of carbon, this externality we're imposing on all of our future generations, there's absolutely no question they're cheaper. And so not only is this capital that we were going to invest, it will turn out in the long run that this is the better way to invest it. And by better, we don't just mean cheaper, we also mean cleaner. Both. And there is no win-lose proposition here. It is a win-win proposition.
It's definitely business sense as well. Do you get a sense, Carlos, that the international community really gets its head around the higher income nations? They really get their head around how difficult it is for nations such as the Philippines to actually achieve, to implement these NDCs?
I think they do understand it. I think in their minds, they know how difficult it is, not only to acquire the technology, not only to make the investment decision, but also to make the political decisions around these investments. However, I think they are hesitant at the moment, and of course, they have expressed great intention to help, but we in the Pacific area, we are, as I said, one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. We are waiting for actual action.
Which is what COP's about. Action, action, action. The how.
Exactly.
Yeah. I want to bring in COVID, Ahmed, because it's an opportunity to, when countries are spending, which clearly many are, to, as Jonathan was saying, to use this opportunity to green economies, to spend on clean energy, to really invest in the energy transition. Are we seeing enough of this in this region or not?
We're seeing important moves in the right direction. And in every country, the talk is of building back better. And in every country, when people mean, what they mean by better is they mean inclusive and they mean green. And so I think the ambition and the direction of travel is entirely right. It is a long journey, and we will have a long ways to go, not just to recover from this pandemic, which has hurt the most vulnerable countries, the most vulnerable populations within those countries the most, but also to make the transition to a cleaner energy mix.
Yeah. I mean, Jonathan, the lessons from COVID in the way that nations have collaborated, some have gone insular. How do we use COVID as an example to tackle climate in a more substantial and more effective way?
I think COVID got some good lessons that we can take. I am struck by the rapidity of technological change in the COVID model. I don't think we've ever had a health crisis like this, in which in the span of really a year, we've moved from the development of a vaccine, which is a technological advance of extraordinary level, to actually getting a vaccine out into the world. It has not been equally distributed. So from climate, the technological advance, we have shown that we can do it. We have shown that we can mobilize at the national level literally $1 trillion from this country or that country or the collective. So the issue is political will, and that's demonstrated. The only other point that I would make is that I don't know that climate's quite the same. There are a set of things that I think we haven't yet done either for COVID or for climate that really have to do with communities that are specifically disadvantaged. How do you manage a transition? In the case of COVID, I would argue that too much of the recovery has been conventional. Too much of the recovery has brought us back to where we were pre-COVID. The United States is guilty just as the rest of the world. We do it in storms. We actually have laws that say you should build back what you had before because we're not looking to give a handout to people. So you build the same house on the same vulnerable piece of the coast and the next storm washes it away. We do the same thing with COVID. If you build back from COVID not to include climate change, climate's going to get you. But you could build back better. You could build resilient communities. You could take this $1 trillion and invest it in infrastructure and transitions. And I'm quite hopeful that that's the direction of travel.
Has the Philippines embraced this wonderful build back better notion, Carlos?
Absolutely.
Yes.
But let me go back to the point you made earlier about lessons we learned in COVID.
Yes.
In 2017, I made a very strong statement to the ADB, to AIIB, and to the World Bank, and saying, look, small countries cannot deal with 3 different institutions. Why don't you start working together? And I must say that when COVID came around, we were able to get ADB, World Bank, and AIIB to actually syndicate a loan for us. I don't think this has ever been done in the past, okay, where they really work together. Now, using that as an example, I think it's very likely that to address climate change, ADB, AIIB, Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank and the World Bank have actually can actually work together to address climate change problems and introduce green elements to their loans.
Let's hear it from the ADB side. Talk to us about the sort of the malleability of those institutions, Ahmed, how you work together and how we can continue that work to tackle climate.
Well, I think there's no question that, as Secretary Dominguez said, small countries, and the Philippines is not a small country, but nevertheless it confronts the same issue. Government officials have a lot on their plate. And the last thing they need is, 3 institutions or 4 institutions who are in the same lane who can't sort out their issues amongst themselves before they arrive at the government's doorstep. And so it is an important obligation for me and my colleagues at my institution and those at peer institutions to make sure that we collaborate. And I think that as important as that was during the COVID crisis, and it certainly was important, it's equally important when it comes to climate. The challenge I think we sometimes have is we and our peers, we're all on the same team, but sometimes we play the same position. And we need to realize that we're all on the same team.
You can't have 10 Tom Brady's, can you? Or 10 Messi's or 10 Ronaldo's. You've got to stick in the position. I want to move on to initiatives, gentlemen, because this is where I do a mini bit of finger pointing at the Philippines. Yes. But we've got a solution as well, because the Philippines, Carlos, as you well know, it's the world's 3rd biggest plastics polluter in the oceans. But you're doing something about it.
Yeah.
What are you doing to curb the use of single-use plastics? Because you've got this single-use plastic products regulation bill, haven't you?
Yes. In fact, it is only the Duterte administration that actually got it passed in the lower house. And it's ready for presentation to the Senate, which I hope will act with alacrity on this particular bill. We realized this early on, and we are totally embarrassed about being a very large polluter in the oceans. But with this bill, and as I was explaining to my colleagues in cabinet and our colleagues in the legislature, this bill will allow each and every Filipino daily to contribute to the greening of our country and the greening of our oceans. I said this is the most important contribution we can make.
Taking individual ownership,
yes,
so important,
yes,
isn't it?
Yes, and with this bill, they will actually, experience the pain or the joy of helping green our
I'll be seeing more pain now or more joy?
Well, in the beginning, it's going to be painful. Well, let's not kid about it. So certain industries have lobbied very hard against it, but I think with the wisdom of our legislature, they will overcome this.
Are we allowed to mention the C word, the coal word? I promised Ahmed earlier that we'd talk about the energy transition mechanism. This is your chance. Ahmed, you're working very closely with the Philippines, to help phase out coal power generation. But the energy transition mechanism, it's a better name and it's a bigger thing. Just explain it.
Yeah, well, look, I don't think there's a long list of things that can lay fair claim to being the biggest problem on the planet. But coal-fired power is at the top of that list. It's our largest source of greenhouse gases on Earth. It's a particularly large problem in our neck of the woods, in Asia, where many large countries still rely on coal for over 50% of their energy mix. And the challenge is that you can't just wave a magic wand and make it all go away. Countries have growing energy demand. In the case, some of our countries have coal lobbies and coal mining domestically. The mines are owned, or the plants are owned by groups that invested in a different world, 5 or 10 years ago when they didn't have these expectations. And what we're trying to do at ADB is to try to say, well, the developed world, countries like the United States have promised $100 billion. Countries like the Philippines need the money. But what's the most powerful way to put these two together? And our energy transition mechanism is a proposal to create a blended finance platform, something people have talked a lot about in theory, but we haven't seen actually implemented at scale. And to use the presence of concessionary capital from developed countries like the US and from philanthropies to allow us to buy and to shut down coal plants early. And I think that's really important in 2 ways. It's important because we're getting rid of the coal, which is critically important. But actually renewables, wind and solar, which we talk so much about, they're only 2% of global energy production. Because in our countries, coal is sitting on top of them. And the moment you get rid of the coal, suddenly the scope for the growth of renewables grows, by leaps and bounds. And so what we're trying to do is create a financial tool that can be used really to deliver impact, both in terms of reducing carbon emitting sources of power, but also to replace them with what we want to see more of, which
These sorts
is
of
renewables.
tools, Jonathan, it's wonderful, isn't it, to hear about them. We need more. We're going to get more. These sort of efficient, very cleverly impacted tools. Are we getting enough of them?
I think they're just coming. I think there's a number of pieces that we have to invest in, and I think Ahmed talks about them regularly, and ADB is doing it. There are some other parts of the bank community. The World Bank itself is taking some of these on through a blended capital facility on a accelerating coal transition model. But I think there are several parts. There's the technology problem. How do you invest in the utilities, the companies that actually transmit the power and are overseeing the construction of something new? And as you get more renewables, how do you assure reliability? That's a technical problem. We know how to manage it, but there's an initial cost, and you want to pay for that. But there's a second one, which I believe is often not well represented in our financing, and that's the community transition cost. There are a lot of people who were working in those coal mines, and there are people who ran those coal power plants. Will you retrain them to be running a solar facility or a wind farm? Will you give them other economic growth and opportunity? If you do that, you can manage the transition. If you shut it down, and we have examples where we've shut it down, you create civil unrest, you create political barriers and obstacles. But if you don't, you really could do a transition that could be really expeditious.
Yeah, is the Philippines helping on that front? Looking to the future, those industries, coal that have been destabilized and will be destabilized. Are you looking at the people, looking at helping them, retraining them, as Jonathan was saying?
Absolutely. In fact, the project that we are working on with the ADB is a transition mechanism. As you know, we have a very large hydropower plant in Mindanao, and we are in the process of upgrading it. Well, actually refurbishing it so it can operate at capacity. And as we increase that capacity, that will give us the opportunity to buy out older coal-fired power plants and repurposing them. First of all, there are not a lot of people actually working in that particular coal-fired powered plant or in any coal-fired power plant. So it's very easy to retrain them to do other projects. So this project that we're working on, I think, is an almost perfect example of a transition project, transitioning from dirty energy to clean energy. And I just thought of something else, Ahmed. That coal-fired power plant we're talking about is actually foreign-owned.
Yes.
And if we can get the foreign government to buy out those shareholders and donate the shares actually of that company to a government, to our government, or to a group including ADB and other agencies, we can actually shut down that plant. And that foreign government will actually be making a contribution
Oh, wow.
to
Okay.
reducing
Interesting.
the coal-fired power plant.
That's an interesting, we're going to have to follow up on that.
I just realized when I saw the shareholdings that this is a perfect deal we can work on. And then this is where what I was mentioning.
Yeah.
This is where the subsidy element in climate finance can come in.
Sorry, Jonathan, go ahead.
Now, I was just going to add only one more point to this piece of the conversation. The global community is more or less has made the decision to no longer fund international coal. And I think that's a huge change. We saw it most recently just 2 days ago at the G20, in which the G20 countries made a collective decision to halt the international financing of coal. Now, that doesn't change some of the models of the existing structure, which I think Carlos is speaking to, but it does speak to a very different future.
Yes.
And I think that's going to shift
It's a step,
investments.
Jonathan, but is it enough of a step? I mean,
No,
coal
it's a
has
step.
to be, pushed over there, doesn't it? Are we getting there?
And
we don't seem to be.
No, but what you're now seeing is that increasingly coal is no longer competitive in the global marketplace with an alternative. I look at the US as an interesting case in point, but I look at Japan in a similar way. Increasingly, it's China, it's India. I can build a new renewable facility in many of these countries at a lower cost than I can operate an existing coal plant. That fundamentally alters the economics.
Sorry,
but the
Carlos.
important thing is to start with a workable example. And I think in Mindanao, and together with the ADB, we have exactly the conditions for that.
I want to talk, Carlos, about another initiative because there's so much to discuss and we haven't got an infinite amount of time. You're helping protect farmers from crop losses. That's massive through the Philippine Crop Insurance Program. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, the Philippine Crop Insurance Corporation was under the Department of Agriculture, but the president saw it fit to assign it to the Department of Finance, essentially because crop insurance is a finance problem. And we are right now developing a program to increase the coverage of more crops and at the same time involve the private sector in either reinsurance or getting this crop insurance industry going with the Philippine Crop Insurance Corporation as the catalyst. But we are aiming to improve the coverage and actually even lower the costs to society. The government subsidizes part of the cost of the premiums. But if we can expand the coverage by the private sector, we believe we can actually lower the cost to society for this.
Yeah, something you mentioned earlier, I think it was you, Ahmed, we talked about impact, and being a geek, I love to measure impact. And how do we measure impact? And I know it's something that you have to do. How do you do it? Put it simply, how do we measure impact when we're granting loans, investing, mobilizing finance?
Well, I think it's that there's both a general question and a specific question. I think in the context of any specific loan, your impact measurement is going to be a function of what is its intended purpose and effect. And I think one of the most important things that we do need to do when we measure impact is not just talk about the benefit of the loan or the investment, but also to talk about the counterfactual. In other words, what changed as a consequence? And I think the best impact measurement tools really get at this concept that in our world of development, we call additionality. Not just what good did you do, which is an important question, but what difference did you make? And those are different but related questions. And the question of impact, I think, really should be addressing both.
Is that how you look at it, Jonathan?
No, I see it very much the same way. I think you can distinguish between the mitigation impact and the adaptation impact. And I like that distinction because it gives you slightly different metrics. Mitigation is actually very straightforward. At the end of the day, are emissions going down? And today the answer is no. Emissions are continuing to rise. So in an aggregate sense, we have not succeeded. Now, in individual cases, we are succeeding. We are seeing transitions. So when we get down a level and drill in a bit further, we can take those successes and amplify and replicate. On the other end, the impact side, what am I seeing about welfare, livelihoods of people? Are they more resilient? I'm not going to stop typhoons in the Philippines, but I could lead people to recover more quickly from those typhoons. Can I measure that? Can I proactively say, by doing this, I know the next iteration will be better? Can I give them more information, advance warning? Can I build up some transit routes to get people out of the most dangerously affected areas in advance of the storm? When I have the storm, can I move personnel and equipment into the region more quickly? Those are tangible and are measurable.
On adaptation, Jonathan, I mean, are we at the point, and I think I read this on one of your articles, are we dangerously close to the point where action could come too little too late?
Well, it's already too little too late.
Yeah.
I mean, take a look at what we now see around the world in terms of impact, right? You can look at the Philippines and the increased frequency of severe storms. You can look at the United States and the increased frequency of wildfire. You can look at Australia and the drought. You can look at the flooding in the European continent, the burning of the Russian taiga. We are too late. And if we don't act really fast, it's getting worse.
Yeah, it is. I want to talk about green social sustainability bonds, something that the ADB president mentioned in his introduction. And I know you're doing a lot, banks and companies in the Philippines, aren't you?
Yes. We're proud to say that the Philippine companies and banks have actually raised in the last year or so $4.8 billion in green bonds. The Philippine government is also now looking at issuing a green bond. Again, this will be our first issuance, and it will be issued before the end of the year.
And Ahmed, I was looking at your bio earlier. You've got a history of helping nations with launch bonds. Are you encouraged by these sustainable green social bonds? Is it happening quick enough in the Asia and Pacific region?
It's certainly growing, and it's growing quickly. As with all things, I think climate related, we cannot settle for rapid growth. The scale of the challenge is so large that if we rest on our laurels because a particular market has grown 10x, we're stopping way short of where we need to go. And so I think that we're headed in the right direction, and we need these sorts of tools to expand. They certainly are expanding in our region, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah. In the remaining minutes, I want to come back to the US and just look big picture once again. As you've stated a number of times, Jonathan, the US is certainly acting as the world wants it to act. The rhetoric is certainly more hopeful than maybe it was under the last administration. But clearly, there's still a divided Congress. Biden is still trying to push through this very impressive infrastructure bill, which is going to benefit so many aspects of the economy if and when it gets through. Is there an element that the US needs to push this through? The US needs to win the world's trust again, because there have been moments in the past when the US maybe has stumbled, as in the last administration, Kyoto back in the day. Has the US regained the trust of the world when it comes to climate leadership?
So I think trust is one of those things that's easily lost and hard won back. And so in my mind, the process that the Biden administration is going through is an effort both to rebuild trust, but as much to act. And I think in the action will come with it a sense of confidence and renewed assessment of US capacity. I would say two other things. The first is that the United States has not entirely walked away even during Trump. I'm struck by the fact that during that administration, the US policy continued to drive emissions down. They were holdovers from the Obama era in which things continued to act. No small measure because the private sector continued. And the second was a subnational element in which the states, the cities continued. I would note that with importance because I think that's a relevant thing for countries around the world. We tend to think about unique actors. We tend to think, what are governments doing here at the COP? What are governments doing in bond issuances? What are governments doing with regulation? But we leave out the fact that it's private activity. It's the productive capacity of our companies. It's citizens both on the streets and taking individual actions on plastic or on turning off the light switch or on insisting that their elected officials move or on building sustainable communities. I think those constituencies are often underrepresented in the political momentum of the world.
Yeah, talk to me, Carlos, from your perspective, the trust between developed and developing nations. How do you see it from a climate finance perspective? We've already stated, we need the money to be delivered. We need finance to be mobilized together, both public and private sector internationally. But how is that trust right now? How fragile is that trust right now as we sit here in Glasgow at COP26?
Well, as I said, we're looking for action. But when I look at the multilateral agencies, and they are represented very heavily by the by the large developing countries, they are doing the right things. So obviously, their directors who come from the developed countries have maintained that trust among the different countries. But directly with countries, we're not so sure. Okay, but through their agencies, we have a lot of trust with them.
Obviously, we're very grateful for that. But one of the things I would say about multilaterals like the ADB is people think of us as financial intermediaries, that we take the collective savings of the developed world and provide them to the developing world. I would argue that an even more powerful attribute is that we are trust intermediaries, that we are owned collectively by developed countries and developing countries, that we're trusted because we are mission aligned and have a common sense of purpose. And so when we give advice, which is a responsibility we take with great seriousness, we have the benefit of knowing that those we engage recognize we have no other interest than their welfare. And that is an unbelievably powerful commodity and a diminishing one in today's world.
And you said earlier, Ahmed, I wanted to ask you about this, but the events ensured I didn't. So let's get it in there. I know, as you said earlier, and the president said earlier, you've raised your ambition to deliver climate finance to developing member countries to 100 billion from 2019 to 2030. So that's an additional $20 billion to provide support for the climate agenda. Just tell us how that money is going to be spent.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, unfortunately, because of COVID, the needs have also gone up because we have taken a collective step backwards. But a big portion of those funds will go towards mitigation and to a number of areas. Under mitigation, we'll also be investing significantly in transformational adaptation projects. About $12 billion of the $100 billion will go towards the private sector directly. But the remainder, which is public sector funding, will also seek to unlock in a catalytic way private sector capital. And so I think we're going to find that even though that 100 billion ambition is a large one, that in fact the needs exceed even that number.
Final question, gentlemen. I wish I could ask 50 more. We're in Glasgow. We're at COP. Carlos, how are you feeling? What constitutes success? When you leave Glasgow, what's going to make you feel better having been here, having spoken to people, having listened, having learned?
Well, for me, the success here will be to see funds flowing. I'm just the practical guy, okay? And I have to manage our fiscal situation in the Philippines. And certainly, funds flowing towards climate change, adaptation, and mitigation will certainly be very welcome for us.
Jonathan?
So I think the funding is a piece. I think it will only come if countries both state and implement their ambition. If the ambition falls short, we'll put money into the wrong things. If the ambition is not met and grounded in action, it'll be hollow words. So I think you want all of those together.
State and implement. Ahmed?
I mean, I think my sentiment is similar. I think it's time for the rubber to hit the road.
Yeah.
So it's time for talk and good intentions to turn into action.
Perfect way to end it. It's time for the rubber to hit the road, gentlemen. I think it's time for your rubber to hit the road. I know you're all busy, and it's been a fantastic chat, 40 or so minutes long. Thank you so much for your time, Carlos, Jonathan, and Ahmed. That was the Green Finance Session. What a wonderful chat it was today. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.